Kenton de Jong, thank you for being on. So this is my good friend Kenton. We do some work together, and I'm going to try to give an introduction, but you do a lot of things. You wear a lot of different hats. You're known as a historian around town with the graveyards and the Spanish flu. You're known as a really kick-ass web dev, which is how we work together on a lot of stuff. And then you're also known for your travel blogging. So I kind of wanted to touch on like all those 3 points, and I think what we could probably start with is the Spanish flu. Um, what how you know so much about it, what made you interested in it, and kind of how it's related to COVID. And I know a lot of people have been reaching out and talking to you about the relation between COVID and the Spanish flu as a historian with vivid
Yeah,
interest in it.
yeah, especially lately, the past year and a half, getting a lot of phone calls, emails, interview requests talk about the relationship between the Spanish influenza and COVID-19. And there's a lot of similarities, but there's some big important differences. Spanish flu only lasted like it lasted 3 years on the calendar from 2018 to 20 sorry from 1918 to 1920, but it only really lasted about a year and a half. Right, it started in October of 1918 and ended pretty much by June of 1919. So like it didn't go as long as maybe even comparable length as COVID-19 is going to be. But everyone kind of thinks that it lasted 3 whole years. It didn't last 3 whole years. It killed people a lot faster and infect people a lot worse. Um, for example, in Saskatchewan itself in 1918, between the months of October, November, December, we lost almost 4,000 people. Now, with COVID-19, we are 16 months in, 17 months into it, we've lost about 530. So it's very different, night and day different in that regard. But the policies they've implemented, the backlash, the politics are identical. The lockdowns, the school closures, the emergency hospitals, the attempts for vaccination. It's actually interesting. Like they're vaccinating out at Everest Place, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's the same location where they had the camp set up during the Spanish flu, where the soldiers came, and that's where it started from. Like exactly the same location, 104 years later.
I
It's
didn't know
crazy.
that.
Yeah, it's the same spot.
Well, so
That
like you know so much about this, and every single time I talk to you, you always have some kind of interesting tidbit. Um, I'm interested in how you know so much about this, and I know it's just something where you maybe gained a little bit of interest, and you just kind of run with anything you're interested in and want to do research on.
well, I am kind of like that. It's a curse, but this topic actually. So it goes back a couple of years ago. I think it was this 2016, maybe even. And I got this tour book of the old Regina Cemetery. They made two tour books back then, and this tour book, talked about some of the founding fathers of the city, some of the people who kind of were established, when the city first began, mayors, police, that kind of thing. And then at the small uh, bottom of one of the pages, it said in a square box, "Here are the victims of the Spanish influenza," or "Here lies the victims of the Spanish influenza." And I'm like, "What is the Spanish influenza?" Right? Because I never learned about that in school. And if you pick up a history book, you're not going to really learn about that either. Everything was about World War One, and then World War One ended, and then it was the Roaring Twenties. What they didn't mention was the Spanish flu, which was just as deadly as World War One, but only for a year and a half. It killed just as many Canadians as the First World War, and more Canadians than the Second World War. We're not talking about that. No one has any monuments or memorials for these people that died because it was a pandemic, not a war. It doesn't have that hero element to it. So as I learned more about the pandemic and learned about what happened in the city and in the province, I thought, we should do something about this. So I raised money and put up a monument in the cemetery at that spot where the book said these people are buried. But there's some challenges with that. So, for example, the city of Regina doesn't have records of what people who were buried there died from. So we just know that there are people buried there, but not what they died from. Spears Funeral Home, they're the ones who buried them, but they lost all of their records from 1918 in a fire. So it's a mix. You have to look back and you have to say, well, this so and so died between the months of October and December 1918. There's a good chance they died from the Spanish flu, but not necessarily. So it is not perfect history, but never is perfect history.
I think like so you're known as the expert because you are one of the only people that's really talking about this or writing about
Mm.
it, which is it's really cool. It's really interesting. But when you say that people have reached out to have calls with you about things, how do they find out that you're the guy to talk to?
So, like, I have been on interviews across the country. Like I was on Global National, I was on CBC. I've been interviewed by people on from Ontario and Quebec, people from Alberta. I think it's like if anyone looks up Spanish flu, you know, Saskatchewan or Spanish flu monument, I pop up. This one guy said he was looking for monuments about the Spanish flu on Google, and the only thing he could find was me. On every search result was me.
So it is just
Um,
because of the lack of other people talking about it, or
yeah,
yeah, that's like it's really cool, and I know that you know a lot about it and you're passionate about it. So it's awesome that they have you as a resource. Uh, but yeah, so it's that's very cool. I didn't even know it was like a national thing. Do you have like a little circle of other people who are Spanish flu aficionados that you talk to?
yes, I do.
Is there anyone who's academically inclined, like someone who does history at post secondary level or even high school or
Yes. So actually, when this whole thing started, there was like no resources, right? And we found a paper written in 1989 by now Professor Michelle Lux. It was her U of S, sorry, research paper. It was a thesis for graduation, and she did like a 400-page thesis on the Spanish flu in the province. The statistics, the numbers, like who, what, where, why, how. Only issue is she focused primarily on Saskatoon and rural Saskatchewan, not Regina. But she was a great resource to get bigger numbers and the bigger picture. So I do talk to her sometimes because whenever I do certain stuff, I have to ask for permission to check in on her, see how she's doing out in Ontario, right? But to think like she did that before I was even born, right? So that document's been sitting there. Probably nobody has read it in 30 years. And then I'm like, hey, what's this book? Pretty much it's a book, right? It's a big fat document.
400 pages? Like I wouldn't even try to read that. Have you read the whole thing?
Skimmed it a few
Okay,
times.
okay.
I don't have the patience
You
to
didn't
read
have
that.
to admit that. I think everyone would have taken your word for it too, but you're an honest guy. So, yeah. So, like the Spanish flu, like I know you have a huge stake in the graveyards in Regina specifically. Like what is this tick for history and specifically with I don't know something as macabre as death and how to get there and where they end up.
Everyone has asked me about my fascination of death, and it's like I don't know the answer to that, but it's always kind of been there. Fascination with history, fascination of death, what comes after all this, what's the point of being here? Um, I find that stuff like I'll talk about the cemetery for a second. Maybe that'll explain this better. If you go through the cemetery, you'll find stories of people, mothers, fathers, sons, daughters, right? But these are stories that have kind of been forgotten by time. People who lived their lives, had their dreams, their hopes, aspirations, and something or nothing happened to them when they died. And just to think that one day, regardless of what I do in my 81 on average years in alive in Canada, that'll be me, right? I will eventually be in the ground and people will forget about me. So to think like there are 30,000 people in the old Regina Cemetery. That's as many people that can fit in the stadium. Like it's massive. And it's a small cemetery compared to other ones in the country. But these names and graves are stories that people don't talk about, that names that they don't share or learn from. Like you can go to some graves, a whole family is there. You got a mother who has 7 stillborn children. What happened? What's the story, the challenge of that family? Every grave you go to has that, and I think that is the passionate reason that I do this to find those stories.
I'm gonna wholly recommend anyone watching this to check out some of your stuff. Like you have your travel blog. I've been to some of your talks, both virtual and in person.
Mm.
And yeah, I'm always like I'm always floored with like the new tidbit or the new person that you've talked about, and I don't want to butcher anything and bring up like my favorites off the top of my head. I didn't really prepare for this a whole lot, but I do know that every single time I've seen one of your talks, it's always been really entertaining. And then you also have the video game that's you had released, an educational more or less video game about the cemetery. Talk about that a little bit.
So that was 2019. I did that. I think so. Yeah, before the pandemic. So I used to do tours, physical walking tours of the cemetery. But as time went by, there was some complications about if we should do them, if not, and this to kind of still operate the tours in the sense without the paperwork of a physical tour of the cemetery. I decided to build a video game, and I'd never done a video game before, and it was like when I started, I had this idea of what it was going to be, and then I realized it was going to be a whole lot more work. um, but it only took about 6 months, which is pretty good. I mean, it's you walk around and you read graves and you avoid ghosts. I mean, it's not too complicated. There's not a lot of voice acting or plot lines involved, but
Well,
uh,
that's sharing like two of the things you have an affinity for, which is development work as well as like your history, and especially with grave sites and local history.
yeah.
Um, and like I think that's awesome. I think that's an awesome passion project, and it turned out really well. Like it's a lot of fun.
Mhm.
I think you've distributed it to schools, and you've had a couple of articles written about it. Um,
Uh, yeah,
I will provide like a link in the description because it's free still, right?
yeah, it's free.
Yeah. So it's another thing that is worth checking out for sure.
Yeah, I wanted to get into schools and kind of show kids how to learn about local history and some of the local stories because, like, you don't learn anything about Regina history in your school, right? But the past year has been kind of tough approaching schools. They don't really have a fixed curriculum in 2020, and 2021 is kind of up in the air too. But that is the plan, to get to schools and get kids to learn about it, and even nothing else to inspire them to learn how to code and learn about their own city.
Well, and you had done some workshops at the library downtown. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah.
And is that going to be something that's going to continue on or be revisited? After we're all poked and ready to go.
I think so. I did some web development courses with them last year, and those went over very well. And I even took the game on 2019, I think it was, and did like a kind of like a virtual, not a launch because we already launched it, but like a virtual playthrough, and
Mm-hmm.
that went very well, very good. So I would think so. And actually, I forgot about this. Right before the pandemic hit, so we're talking like January, February, March 2020. Me and a couple other guys were hired by the library to make a game to talk about the history of video games at the library. We made a little video game and we put it to the library. They paid it for us. They put it on display, and like 2 days after they opened the display, it's when the pandemic hit and they
Oh
shut it
no.
down. Yeah, and it was just devastating. So like we did all the work, we opened it, we were super excited, and then got shut down. So I hope to work with
Obviously,
stuff
that's
that
something they can revisit.
yeah.
Yeah, it's not like it's a time focused thing. Talking about history going all the way back to Pong or even
Uh,
further.
how far back?
Going back to Pong, or are you going even further?
Well, it was tricky because it was like a mix between video games and like the internet, right? And like there's a Pong is before internet, but like even early internet stuff is very similar to Pong. So, for example, your character, you walk through different rooms, you kind of see the history of video games. The first one is all ASCII art, and ASCII art's kind of similar to Pong.
In a way, yeah. No, it's honestly, I don't want you to talk about it anymore because I think that when that comes back to the library, whatever type of situation is going to come from the ashes there, I think I'd want to have you on to talk about that a little more. But I do want to talk about something, and anyone who's watching the video podcast knows that your camera's cutting out, and the thing that keeps popping up is the Kenton de Jong travel, which
Yeah,
is your travel blog.
yeah.
Now, you have still been travel blogging, but you haven't been traveling for obvious reasons. Um, so how has that been?
So, it's been challenging, sometimes like disheartening, because like right before it all got locked down, I had gone on a trip to Utah, right? And I talked about Arches National Park, and I talked about Salt Lake City, I talked about all these places to go, and I couldn't talk about it because no one could go anywhere,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like March March, April, May of 2020, we were all completely locked down. We couldn't go anywhere and do anything. So like those articles, which were great in my opinion, the photography was amazing, the stories were great, the history was cool. No one read it because no one was interested, right? So after that, I had to kind of go back to my roots because I wasn't going anywhere and talk about Regina. So we did a lot of local unboxings. We did some promoting local restaurants, local businesses. Um, Lately, we've been doing some little road trips around the province. You know, going to some old churches, going to smaller towns, because we technically weren't allowed to leave the city until about last month.
Mm-hmm.
So it was like we tried to stay within an hour of Regina and even sometimes stay closer. Um, so it's been challenging. You know, you see some people, they're out traveling the world still. They're out traveling the province of the country, and I'm like, it's not putting out a good message. You know, that we are all in this together. You have to stay together, and you're out doing this. But I understand that still some people have to make a living, and I'm fortunate enough that I don't have to because I am fully employed already. So
Working
I
from
don't.
home.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
I think probably if anyone's going to rejoice at the fact that we're going to be open up again and you can start seeing things in other people, it's going to be you. Do you have any plans for anywhere you're going to go as soon as things open back up?
Um, I'm not sure yet. I was thinking maybe Alberta, the mountains. My camera won't turn back on. I'm so sorry about this
No, no,
one.
hey, it's okay. I don't mind talking to a bubble. You know, we're here for your voice anyway. Half the podcast is going to be audio anyway, and I'm curious to how many people are actually going to watch the video portion.
Hmm.
So yeah, no, don't worry about it. Not a big deal.
Okay. So I was thinking Alberta, going to see the mountains again. There's a hike down near Calgary I wouldn't mind checking out. It's to this old abandoned airplane that kind of crashed, I think, in the 60s, maybe in the 50s. Ideally, I'd like to go back to the coast, you know, maybe the Maritimes, but probably for the next little while will be Alberta, just to get out of Regina and now Saskatchewan for a bit. But
When do you anticipate you're going to be able to travel?
when?
Yeah.
Well, Alberta is saying they're going to be open for tourism come July. I think that's pretty ambitious, but probably
Are
this
you
summer.
vaccinated at least with your first shot already?
I got my shot a few weeks ago.
Yeah.
I think I can get my second one on July 5th.
And you're probably just in line waiting like you're outside waiting for a tickle me Elmo.
I will
Christmas
be
Day.
there in line the day it comes. Yeah.
Oh, well, that's awesome, man. I look forward to just kind of reading more about you getting out. I don't think it's affected your writing too much. I check out your blog as much as I possibly can, and I think anyone who knows you would know that you're a very optimistic guy, and that kind of comes across in your writing. And in most cases, there's definitely been some outliers there, but it's always a fun read regardless.
Some outliers. That's a good way of putting it.
I that's not something I want to touch on today, but
No, that's fine.
I know there's some fun articles and history behind those that I think we can definitely touch on another time. But I do
Yeah.
want to touch base on the other aspect of you as a person is your development work. Now, Kenton is someone that I've worked with for years and years now, and I call on you as someone I can lean on for a little bit of dev work here and there, because you're very versatile in what you work with. You're very versatile as both a programmer and a web developer. Um, so when I'm not working with agencies, I do work with a few agencies here and there, and it's something that I'll bring you in on for smaller projects and stuff. So um, the one thing that I've always noticed though is that I think it's tough for you to put value on yourself and your work. Do you still struggle with that?
Yeah, I do. It's I'm trying to get better at it. It's one of those things where it's like I'm pretty busy, and how much this is my idea lately is how much is worth time of my day to do something else. You know, I'm busy with my own work, with my full time job. I'm busy with my own projects. How much should I charge someone to take an hour out of my day for them? And that's kind of what I'm thinking of lately. Um, it kind of I came to that point when I was doing some freelance work, and the company, like the hosting company, said that they would do what I was going to do, but at $200 an hour. I'm looking at that and thinking, that's four times my rate, and it's the same thing. Like if they're going to charge someone $200 an hour to do something that I can do for 50, why not charge more? Because they're going to charge more. They don't care.
Mm-hmm.
So that got me thinking that it's time to start, putting some value behind my work because apparently it's worth $200 an hour. I'll probably never charge that much, but apparently it's worth that much.
I think the old adage is it's always worth whatever someone's willing to pay. Um, and this necessarily doesn't qualify for us because we've been doing our work for quite a few years now. But there's so much anxiety getting into any kind of freelance work where you are then starting to charge for your work or sending out quotes or discussing those financial side of things. And I think there's a lot of people that sell themselves short or just kind of take whatever they can get without pushing back.
Yeah, a lot of people. I don't want to call it a race to the bottom, but a lot of people will think like, "Oh, I'll just charge this amount because I want that client, I want that sale." But if you charge double and you make half as many sales, you make the same amount of money.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
And that's what I struggled with for a long time too. I
yeah.
just want I just want that sale.
Well, and this is something that often gets discussed with freelancers, but there's the whole concept of asshole tax, which, if people
Yeah.
don't know, it's charging someone more than you normally would to see if that's going to affect kind of their disposition of accepting the contract or not. And if they do accept the contract, that kind of leads into being a little more palatable for you to take on as work.
Yes, and even sometimes with like ongoing projects, if you really don't want to do it, you know, tell them it's going to take, twice as long as it usually does because, if they really want it, they'll pay for it. And it makes it a little bit better. It's something I do to some people, especially you got to, when you're working with people, you have to incorporate in conversation time and emailing time and discussion time. You can't just quote in development time because that's only part of the work. But I've been known to increase rates for people who I find are a little more difficult to work with.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I
I
think
think
that's a standard thing, and it's something that a lot of people don't want to talk about. And I might be getting in trouble with recording this podcast because I want to be as honest and frank as possible and discuss people in marketing, advertising, dev industries of what their struggles might be. Hopefully, some people will get some insight, whether it's prospective clients or agencies or people starting out in freelancing, um, because it is something that there's not necessarily a whole lot of honest people. I try to work with as many honest people as possible, people who do good, solid work. And what I found is, shortly after starting up, I didn't want to charge asshole tax anymore. I didn't want to run into those situations where I was working with people who were putting my mental health at like a detriment, or projects that just weren't going anywhere. And like so I think maybe not necessarily adding on that tax or trying to avoid situations like that altogether is my mandate now. But I think I'm also privileged in that case because I'm established, and I think you're also at the case too where you are established and you can kind of see red flags before they come.
yeah. And no, we've been doing this for a couple of years, and we were doing this many years before we met each other. But like back then, you would take anything. Now you will turn down things. Okay, I don't have time for that. Hey, it's not worth my time. That's not enough money for that kind of project, and that kind of weeds them out because you deal with people who want to short you on a project, who won't want to pay the full rates because it's just not worth the time. And now we're at the position we can do that. But at the beginning, to turn down a client, to turn down a website, I would have been insane because that's all we had.
Well, and it is us being new and kind of being hungry, and when you're starving, you'll pretty much do anything you possibly can get your hands on. But on the flip side too, do you have any advice or insight for anyone who is in that position now?
Charge what you're worth, and that can vary on who you are and what you're doing, right? But if you are doing a job and it's taking a long time, make sure you're paid for it, because you're doing what you love. And you might not make, minimum wage, but don't short yourself. If you're doing what you love, be sure you get paid to do it. I know a lot of people who design, who transcribe, who do work like that, and they work long hours, but they don't get paid very good. So charge your worth. And if they say, well, it's too much, then you can go find someone else. They can go find someone else. Um, that's probably the best advice.
I think it's good advice, but I want to kind of clarify, like, how do you find your worth? How do you find your
Well,
value?
that's the question that I even struggle with. You could look at other people that are charging. You could compare your work to them. That's what happened to me when I was found that agencies charging that much money. I'm like, oh, my rates are far too low for my work. Um, but sometimes it takes a matter of you get a client, you say this is my rate, and if they accept it, cool. The next client, maybe your rate's a little bit higher.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's $5 more an hour or whatever, how you're charging. Until you get no, then okay, well that's kind of the rate I'm worth. But that'll also change over time.
Yeah.
That's a hard question. How do you know how much you're worth? It's personal too, but also it goes against the industry. You don't want to. If you charge too much, you won't make any sales. If you charge too little, you won't make any money.
Well, I don't want to poo poo on agencies, and I don't think you want to either, because there is a benefit to working with agencies versus working with individuals. Oftentimes, agencies will contract people out, such as yourself, and that gets built into the rate. They might have some people in house that are able to do things, and most people will have some way to facilitate some kind of collaboration outside of the agency, and it takes away some of the complications. So agency work, even though they will charge more, isn't necessarily a bad thing. And the type of work can be completely different from agencies to individual freelancers.
Yeah, there are, and agencies also usually have more overhead than freelancers do. There's a reason their prices are higher.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, yeah. So, and I think there's value in kind of a lot of this stuff, and as much as I want to remain as neutral as possible, I'll still kind of sing praises of types of working relationships where it is beneficial. But I'm not going to shy away from things that I don't see value in for sure. So, yeah, I think that's kind of all I wanted to touch on. Like, you got so much going on. I want you to talk about it a little bit in terms of like projects you're excited about, and let people know what you're up to and where to find you.
Projects I'm excited about. That's a long list.
Yeah, give me a couple, because I always like to try to keep these as short as possible. They're going to run over half hour. That's just an inevitability.
So one thing I'm trying to make time for is to write a book about the Spanish flu. It's a challenge right now because like writing for me is an escape from reality, but in this case it really isn't. Because it's like, oh, I don't want to hear about the people dying every day. I'm gonna go write my book about people dying every day. So now that the pandemic's kind of slowly going down and people are going back to normalcy, I kind of have a new spark to start writing about it. Um, I'm a little worried that when this finally goes out, there'll be a lot of books about the pandemic, about the COVID-19 pandemic, right? That's what happened after the First World War. There was a war book boom.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm excited about the book. We'll see if it ever happens, but it has been kind of that. It's been on my corner of my desk for about a year now, and suddenly it's kind of closer to my computer. I'm like, oh, right. Um, Also, we talked about the game, this Drowned Cemetery Tours game. I've been thinking about redoing it and putting it on Steam because some people they don't want to play it because it's a free game. They think it
Mm.
isn't worth their time. But if you can say, yeah, this game is $10, maybe they'll want to buy it. So I'm looking at redoing it. But that's a long term. It was a pretty big game to make the first time. I don't really want to make it a second time.
Well, so besides that, like, where can people find you and these projects that you're working on?
So they can find me on my blog, kentondejong.com. They can find me on Facebook, Kenton Young Travel. I'm on Instagram, Twitter, and my new YouTube channel, which is doing pretty good. I'm pretty much everywhere. if you need to find me. It's
I'll
pretty
have
hard to find
links
me.
to all that stuff at the bottom, and I'm sure you'll probably think of a couple others to let me add in after the fact when we upload this.
Sure. Yeah, that sounds good.
Cool. Well, hey, man, I appreciate it. I think we're pretty close to time here. But yeah, as always, man, like love chatting with you. I love hearing what you got going on. I want to have you back at some time in the future, and that is going to happen. It's not just an if.
I would love to be back on, and hopefully at that point you'll see my face the whole time and not just this little bubble on the screen.
Well, you can't have too much beauty, right? It detracts from me, right? That's I got to start bringing on less attractive people.
Yeah, sure, we'll go with that. But I think you look great, man.
Well, thanks, buddy. You sound great, but
Thanks.
thanks for being on again, man. We'll talk to you soon.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I always appreciate it. It's good to see you.
Awesome.